Well, thank you, Frank. Good morning. Thank you for everyone for gathering here, and I appreciate this conference being assembled to address the growing plague facing the world. And by that, of course, I mean the Crusades. This is an important gathering. Let me say thank you to the Center for Security Policy for its leadership for the Secure Freedom Strategy, a comprehensive, serious strategy addressing the threat of radical Islamic terrorism. You know, it's fairly striking, this gathering, the contrast with next week's Countering Violent Extremism Summit. It's almost as if the so-called violent extremism is just popping up spontaneously with no connection to any ideology. And if you are not aware of what you're fighting, you're not going to defeat it. These are perilous times in the world. And it is critical that we do two things. Number one, that we name and understand the enemy that we are fighting. And number two, that we defeat that enemy. Now, when it comes to naming and understanding the enemy, there is a consistent thread that links together ISIS and Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah and Boko Haram and the Taliban. And it is not simply some abstract violent extremism. It is radical Islam. It is the Islamist philosophy of jihad to use force and murder and violence to attempt to subjugate, to attempt to terrorize, to attempt to kill any who dare disagree with their extreme vision of Sharia law. Now, anyone who observes the president talking about this, or anyone in the administration, quickly notices that there's a set of words, it's almost as if they're given a card, a do not speak card. The words radical Islamic terrorism do not come out of the president's mouth. The word jihad does not come out of the president's mouth. And that is dangerous. You know, I made reference to the prayer breakfast last week. I was at the prayer breakfast. And it was fairly stunning to see the president get up and preach a moral relativism. Yes, there are radical terrorists. Mind you, he wouldn't note they were Islamic terrorists, but there are radical terrorists. But quickly, he moves that those of other faiths have done terrible things, and he quickly shifted to the Crusades and the Inquisition. Now, the last I checked, the Crusades began in the 11th century. I don't think it's too much to ask for the president to stay in the current millennium. The Crusades ended over 700 years ago. Let's be very, very clear. If there were Christians torturing and murdering those who disagreed with their faith in order to impose their faith on others, I and the men and women gathered here would not hesitate an instant to speak out against that perversion of faith. If there were Jews who were torturing and murdering those who disagree with their faith in an effort to forcibly convert them, I and the other men and women gathered here would not hesitate to speak out and say that is a perversion of faith and it is wrong. But right now, those who are doing so all have a common thread, and it is the radical Islamist theology, and political philosophy of jihad. And it is dangerous not to acknowledge it. Now, I will note in that prayer breakfast, the president said something that I think was every bit as troubling as the moral relativism of analogizing what's happening to the Crusades. And I would note he did so just days after ISIS had taken a Jordanian pilot, put him in a cage, doused him in gasoline, and lit him on fire. The moral relativism of saying, well, 7 centuries ago, other people of different faiths did terrible things too, so it's all the same. Another component of the president's remarks was that he talked about free speech and freedom of religion are intertwined. And he said you cannot have one without the other. And when someone exercises their free speech to criticize the faith of another, we should all condemn it. Now, I found that a rather stunning assault on free speech from the president. It got very little press attention. Because, lest it be lost on anybody, what the president was saying is that Charlie was wrong to put a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad on their magazine. And implicitly what that's saying is the terrorist who murdered those journalists had a legitimate grievance. That is wrong, that is pernicious. All across the world, people were saying, "Je suis Charlie," standing up for freedom of speech. And I would note, criticism and even ridicule of faith is not limited to any particular faith. I'm a Christian. Some time ago, there was news of an artist who had submerged a crucifix in a vat of urine. It was pleasantly entitled, "Piss Christ." Now let me tell you, that is offensive. And yet no one would have sought to murder the artist for insulting or ridiculing my faith. Right now on Broadway, a play is showing the Book of Mormon that is ridiculing and making fun of the Mormon faith. Last I checked, Mitt Romney didn't show up on Broadway trying to blow up the stage. It is not a permissible response for anyone of any faith to say, if you disagree with, or if you criticize, or even if you make fun of my faith, I will murder you. No one in any faith has the right to make that statement. And imagine how different it would have been if the president at the prayer breakfast had instead focused on a very different speech, a speech just a few weeks ago that President al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, gave in Cairo. Now, I'm confident the men and women around this table are aware of that speech. It was a brave, it was a courageous speech for President al-Sisi, where he stood up as a Muslim and called out the radical Islamic terrorists that are perverting his faith. And he called on other Muslims to speak out against the jihadists. Now, that was a courageous speech for President al-Sisi to give. In doing so, he knew well that he was risking his life to say that. That these religious zealots and lunatics would only redouble their efforts to come after him. Imagine what a different prayer breakfast it would have been if the president had stood up and commended President al-Sisi for having the courage to speak the truth. Rather than justifying violence through moral relativism of everybody does it, rather than suggesting that we should muzzle free speech because of radical Islamists who take to violence, imagine if the president had been willing to name and understand the enemy. And then the second thing we have to do is defeat the enemy. Once we understand it, and I would note the name of this summit, Defeat Jihad Summit. Next week's gathering, I'm pretty sure they would say, what's that? Because that is not something they're intending to discuss. If you look at ISIS, ISIS is the face of evil. They are beheading children. They are crucifying Christians. They are beheading journalists. This weekend I was in Munich at the Munich Security Conference. And I met with the president of Kurdistan. He described how ISIS is deliberately using rape as a tool of warfare. In particular, he shared a story of one of the communities ISIS has targeted, the Yazidis. He shared a story of a young Yazidi man who said to him, "They have captured and raped my mother, my sister, and my wife. How can I bear to live with what they have done to my family?" He spoke of the enduring grievous wound. That's what ISIS is carrying out right now. Congress is preparing to debate an authorization on the use of military force. I think that is a good thing. I think that is consistent with the Constitution that ascribes the power to declare war to Congress. But one of the great benefits of it is that I hope it will force this administration to clearly articulate their objective and their specific plan to accomplish that objective. That the process of going to Congress and seeking authorization leads to the natural question, authorization to do what? What do you intend to do and how do you intend to do it? With regard to ISIS, we have not seen a seriousness of purpose. We have seen instead photo-op foreign policy, a bomb here, a missile there. Some months ago in the Senate Armed Services Committee, I took the opportunity to ask the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, what would be required militarily if the objective were to destroy, not to degrade, not to weaken, to destroy ISIS in 90 days? What would be required militarily? The response from General Dempsey, "I'm sorry, that is simply not possible." Now my response was, okay, perhaps that time frame is unrealistic. You tell me from the military perspective, if the object is to destroy ISIS, what is required to do so? The response was, we cannot destroy ISIS until we change the underlying conditions on the ground that make young men in poverty susceptible to extremism. Now, there is a technical term for such things. It is nonsense. At the bar, it's a different technical term. But live streamed in front of our friends in the media, nonsense is the term we will use. The solution to ISIS is not eradicating poverty throughout the Middle East. The solution to ISIS is not expanded Medicaid in Iraq. The solution to ISIS is to hunt down and kill the terrorist leaders. But when you have an administration that will not utter the words radical Islamic terrorists, you have an administration that is unwilling to effectively design and implement a strategy to defeat radical Islamic terrorists. And I would note one of the critical elements to doing so is we should right now, immediately, be arming the Kurds. I mentioned meeting with the president of Kurdistan. The Kurds have been friends of America for decades. The Peshmerga are effective, disciplined, serious fighters. They are boots on the ground right now, this instant. They are fighting the fight with ISIS right now, this instant. The problem is ISIS has U.S. military equipment that they've seized, and they're using it to murder the Kurds. And we, rather foolishly, are insisting on sending any military aid through Baghdad, which delays and prevents the Kurds from actually getting that weaponry. And the entire approach is driven by a desire of seeking political consensus and compromise. You hear the administration say on and on that first in Iraq we've got to see the different groups come together in peace and harmony. We have to bring Shia and Sunni together. Listen, the Shias and Sunnis have been battling with each other since 632 AD. For a president of the United States to believe that he is going to resolve a 1,500-year-old religious conflict is the height of hubris and ignorance. It's not our job or objective to cause Sunni and Shiite to sit down and break bread together and embrace like brothers. It is our job to prevent radical Islamic terrorists who want to murder Americans and our allies from being able to do so. We need to stop these silly political considerations from getting in the way of providing serious weaponry on the ground to the Kurds to hunt down and kill the ISIS leaders. We also need to recognize the threat of that coming back home. There have been roughly 100 Americans that we know of who've gone and joined ISIS. In the Senate, I've introduced the Expatriate Terrorist Act, simple legislation that says if you go and take up arms against America, if you join ISIS, by doing so, you forfeit your U.S. citizenship. We should not be allowing jihadists to go and train with ISIS and come back here with American passports to American cities to murder innocent men and women carrying out their radical Islamist philosophy. That is the height of foolishness, and it is my hope in Congress that we can see bipartisan agreement. That at a minimum, let's protect this country. And I would note, by the way, there is an existing statute that provides for the forfeiture of U.S. citizenship. What my legislation does is it simply adds joining a radical terrorist group like ISIS to one of the grounds for forfeiture of citizenships. In addition to ISIS, there is, I believe, an even greater threat. And that is the threat of the nation of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons capability. In my view, that is the single gravest national security threat facing this country. You know, just recently, President Obama did a press conference with Angela Merkel. He made two comments that I thought were highly revealing and reflected the manifest failures of the Obama-Clinton-Kerry foreign policy. One comment the president made was, quote, "It is entirely legitimate for the American people to be deeply concerned when you've got a bunch of violent, vicious zealots who behead people or randomly shoot a bunch of folks in a deli in Paris." Now, I want to draw your attention to one word the president used there. Randomly. No sentient being believes what occurred there was random. They were not shooting people at random. They were shooting Jews because of their Jewish faith. We have a president who not only refuses to acknowledge that, but affirmatively speaks the contrary. This is not just random violence. This is a very direct religious theology and political philosophy. And a second thing he said regarding Prime Minister Netanyahu's continued press for meaningful sanctions to deter Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capability, the president said, quote, "What's the rush?" You know, 3 words that can sum up the entirety of the Obama-Clinton-Kerry foreign policy. What's the rush? What's the rush to protect this country? Leading from behind. The rush is simple. We are right now, I believe, repeating the mistakes of the 1990s with regard to North Korea. The 1990s, the Clinton administration led the world in relaxing sanctions against North Korea. Billions of dollars flowed into North Korea, and they used that money to develop nuclear weapons. The Obama administration has gone and recruited the very same person who led the failed North Korea talks, Wendy Sherman, to lead the failed Iran talks. You can't make this up. And here the dangers are qualitatively greater. With Iran, you have a very different situation from North Korea. North Korea, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, they're radical, they're extreme, they're unpredictable. And yet both father and son fundamentally are megalomaniacal narcissists, which means there's some degree of rational deterrence that's possible. Both father and son understood that if they ever actually used a nuclear weapon, that instant their regime would end. What makes Iran qualitatively more dangerous is its leadership, Khomeini and the mullahs, are radical religious zealots who embrace death and suicide, which means ordinary cost-benefit analysis doesn't work the same way. That's why understanding what it is we're fighting is so important. If you assume these are rational actors, then the Obama administration's policy, which I believe is facilitating Iran acquiring nuclear weapons capability, I wouldn't even go so far as to say makes more sense, a little sense. At least if you misunderstand who you're dealing with, there is a possibility of deterrence. But when you understand religious extremism, it changes the balance. In my view, if Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, the odds are unacceptably high they would use that weapon in the skies of New York or Los Angeles or Tel Aviv. And if they set off a nuclear weapon above Tel Aviv, it would murder vast numbers of Palestinians. And the danger is that Khomeini and the mullahs would find those acceptable losses. That the Muslims they would murder would go to be with Allah. These are leaders who have pledged their intention to annihilate the nation of Israel. And by the way, for anyone who is confused about who their enemy is, it is Israel that they call the little Satan, and it is America whom they call the great Satan. And because the White House seems confused about this, great Satan is not something your friends say to you. If Iran acquires the nuclear weapons, the odds are unacceptably high they might use it. But here, I'm going to close with this point. Here's the alternative. Let's say Iran acquires a nuclear weapon and it doesn't use it. The inevitable result will be nuclear proliferation throughout the Middle East, as one country after another gets nukes to counterbalance Iran. Now, you've got a region that has been a powder keg for most of human history. You will end up with a scenario where you have nukes pointing at each other throughout the region, with governments that have long historical ties to radical Islamic terrorist groups. The danger of nuclear cataclysm becomes exponentially greater. And that, mind you, is the best case scenario. That, mind you, is the scenario that you go, oh, thank God the Iranians didn't use their nuke. They just set off a nuclear arms race in the most dangerous area in the world. And I will say this to any observers. If you're trying to figure out whom to believe about the dangers of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, should you believe President Obama, who seems to believe it's no big deal, whose deputy national security advisor said that an Iranian nuclear deal will be the Obamacare of the second term? I think he meant that as a compliment. If you're trying to decide whether to believe the president, who does not seem concerned about Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, or the men and women gathered here who are, to a person, deeply concerned, then let me suggest some folks you can look to. For many decades, it has been publicly reported and widely acknowledged that the nation of Israel has nuclear weapons capability. And yet, throughout those decades, none of the Arab countries felt the need to get their own nukes. The Saudis, the Egyptians, the Emiratis, not a one of them has had a moment's concern that Israel would affirmatively and aggressively use nuclear weapons against them. They felt no need to respond or reciprocate because they understood the nation of Israel acquired those weapons purely for defensive purposes. What does it say? That the Saudis, the Egyptians are all quite candid that if Iran gets nuclear weapons, you better believe we're getting them immediately. If you want to understand the nature of the Iranian regime, look no further than the Arab neighbors who sit right next door, who understand perfectly well that Khomeini with a nuclear weapon is qualitatively different because the odds are unacceptably high. He might use them. And yet President Obama asks, what's the rush? The first and most important responsibility of the president is to be the commander-in-chief and to protect the national security, to protect the safety and the lives of Americans. Radical Islamic terrorism is a threat to this nation. And we need leadership to stand up and defend the United States of America. Thank you.